So now we're going to welcome questions from you. And if you don't have a question, you just have a statement, you're also welcome to share it with us. But please be respectful to everybody else's willing to share. So please just keep it brief. And this is a full room, if we realize that we're going to be having a lot of questions, we're going to collect a group of questions and then we're going to tackle all of them in a group. Let's tackle these questions and hopefully address all of the points and all the questions that you all have asked. And let's begin with Lamise.
But you don't want to take any more questions?
We'll do a lot.
Yeah, okay. So let me start with, what's your name?
Nathan.
Nathan what? Okay, yeah, okay, so I mean, look, so I think that your question was whether dismantling Zionist institutions would mean dismantling all Jewish institutions, which is not the case. And I think that that's what we're talking about here, is that Zionism is not Judaism. And so non-Zionist social organizations who are not participating in the oppression, exile, massacre, disenfranchisement of the Palestinian people, of course would continue to exist because they would have all organizations would continue to exist. They would be removed of their ability and their role and their incitement to violence and oppression against Palestinians. None of this would touch on the religious organizations. I'm not going to debate you, I'm answering your question. So dismantling Zionist institutions does not mean dismantling Jewish, social, religious, or any other organizations. So I think that answers your questions. The other, when we talk about exposing and criminalizing the actions, which would be illegal technically, of Zionist organizations in the U.S. Yes, there are certainly many organizations that are involved in doing that, and there are yes, yes. No, we're not having a discussion. I'm answering you. You spoke for a while, and I'm answering your question. And there are other questions that are going to be answered. Okay, so just as Hillel House and other racist institutions are being exposed for their racist activity, for being part of engaging in unconstitutional activity, for violations of many basic rights and liberties of many people. That exposure in and of itself, yes, research it, that exposure in and of itself has led to the marginalization of those organizations. More importantly, using the Hillel House example, and perhaps David and Michael can speak to that, what has happened is there are conversations, there is space being made. There is no longer a monopoly by Zionists over what are Jewish organizations or organizations that are claiming to speak for Jewish people. And that's what's happened, and that's been one of the biggest successes. For the other organizations, attacking their 501c3 status and exposing their role in repression in the U.S. is going to be very powerful. So does anybody else want to answer this question before I move to other questions?
I think that it's important to think of the right of return again in simple terms. Everyone tries to complicate it. Everyone's trying to say, but what about the consequences of it, right? The consequences of it is to actually treat people the way you like to be treated. Right? That's a very important, we got to get to a human level over here. It's very important to think that way. Other people will make the argument, well, what are the consequences? Is it a one-state solution or a two-state solution? Look, at least the MENA region has been divided up as part of, a colonized era where borders were created by the British and the French after they left, and they're not holding up, right? So that whole notion of what that region can look like as a one-state or two-state solution misses the point of us people building solidarity, maintaining love, thinking of people power, not the mushy kind of love, the love that MLK talked about, not the kind of unafraid of confrontation, no, the Malcolm X kind of way, right? All of this is back on the table right now, and you see it in the Black Matters movement. And these are the connections that we need to be making. And the fact, again, to single out the Palestinians on the right of return when anyone with a Jewish mother can go back.
No, can go.
Can go, right? Why is that fair? I mean, we just did an event about a week ago or less than a week ago where we showed how actually based on these Israeli courts, they can give you the right to actually take someone else's home who lives there. There's so many things about what's happening over there that are unconscionable. So to actually draw a line on the Palestinian right to return, which is a right that I mean, again, it's not a right in legal terms, it's a human term, right? And it's happening all the time. People think of the refugees, right, who are in Syria or in Lebanon or in whatever, and they forget that we have that 70% of Gaza is refugees.
Yep.
Come on. 2/3 of them just got dispossessed, dislocated again. And then they're being shut down from rebuilding, right? Those are refugees 3 times over. I live over here because I had the privilege of leaving, but actually I was one of the few who could leave, and I'm live in diaspora. What does my life look like? It looks like shit. Because you don't have family, you experience oppression in all sorts of forms of racism over here, right? But you didn't even make the choice yourself. So look, there's this complexity of like, I want to defend my people, but there's a simplicity of like, we're all people. I'm not a nationalist. I don't believe in that bullshit, right? But we're trying to find a way, and I don't think people should really think about the right of return, not as something that is 194 resolution. I appreciate that wasn't mentioned, the damn resolution number, but it's actually a basic right, a human right to return. The other thing I'll say is that we focus on the role of the U.S. It's important. As an imperialist colonizer, Israel was made in its image, right? There are a lot of parallels of what you see in the United States and what is happening in Palestine. But it's also important to think of the U.S. not so much as an abstraction, right? But a composition that we create and every day we consent to it in our lives, right? So there's one way to think of analytically of the U.S. as an important thing to focus on and how does it relate to the region. But it's another thing not to disempower yourself in recognizing that there are things here that matter. Chomsky, for example, if he was here, he would say, look, the U.S., that's where we should focus on. No, we should focus on wherever we are. The struggles are connected, and we need to fight in the ways that we can, because the resistance and the fight changes us inside. And that matters, without any compassion, without any identification with each other in these struggles. And that's why the black struggle matters, and that's why the Native American struggle matters. And then I'll say, in terms of the BDS call, that's an external call for solidarity, right? It's only one half of the equation. The other half of the equation is the 2006 prisoners document in Palestine that identified the way forward post-Oslo. Look, the Palestinians are struggling every day in their different capacities, and we're trying to build something internal. But the idea of boycotting within is very difficult, because we have an economy that is actually economy of dependence that over the course of 65 years, right? They take your land, they don't allow you to export your goods. All these checkpoints are economic, they're not just human dignity issues, right? So there's no way for us economically to be independent. And then you look, and all our grocery stores has Telma and Osam and I don't know what. I mean, that's what we're dealing with too. So what does struggle look like for the Palestinians? And then I'll end with the South African experience, because I think it's true of thinking about South Africa as a model. And that's why when you talk about Palestine, you don't just talk about apartheid. Palestine is a microcosm for every single oppression that you could actually muster. And this is why it's also an important struggle. It's an extension of empire. Hitting it, you hit the imperialism of the United States. But also, it is an illegal occupation where human rights, human dignity, and international law matters little, and you see the power and the politics of that region. It is also a form of ethnic cleansing and experimentation on people as an economy of actually oppressing people, destroying it, and then rebuilding it, and the investments that actually people make money. People are making money off of these deaths. Even the Israeli Jews that actually believe in the state, they're being screwed over too. They don't have housing. It's a 1%, 99%. They live in a racist society that hurts their own dignity. All of these things are also true over there. But the South African experience is important because focusing on votes and being equal in terms of votes misses the part that really matters. This is not just about political equality and then measuring that by representative democracy, which means nothing in this country, let alone in any other country, right? But actually to recognize that there is a restoration. Until now, this country hasn't recognized what they did to the Native Americans or what they did to the black people. Israel's on the same course, right? That restoration is why you still have ghettos, right? Now they call them hoods, right? You still have those. And you wonder why there's crime is disproportionately black, or why your police is actually hurting black people more than whites. And you focus on racism as an externality of it. But this is all part and parcel of the Reconstruction era. And the fact that we didn't live up to that. We didn't live up to those challenges. Palestine presents it twofold.
Just really quickly, just to answer, because there were a lot of other questions that weren't answered, and the mission was accomplished on some level. So there was BDS, the question about BDS being the main fulcrum and getting into Jewish society. David, I'm just going to remind you that that's a question that's out there that still wasn't answered. Joe's question is a critical question. Using the legal model, much to everybody's dismay, when you get hurt, when somebody hurts you, what do? Is you seek a remedy, right, to be restored, right, so that all the injuries that you've suffered they can't be undone, but you could be restored for them. You could be compensated, and it's the same model that we would see in the Palestinian issue, and there's no reason for it to not be that way. And the steps in my in my estimation and my hopes would be first, demanding the admission and the identification of all of those involved in the violence and the oppression against the Palestinians. So admitting and identifying, okay? And then addressing those admissions and identifications, either by prosecution or by restoration, by redistribution of the wrongfully gained resources. This is critical. If you think about between the mid-1940s and 1948, over 75 massacres, over 675 villages. Oftentimes they would be surrounded on three sides. The men would be separated from the women, and the women would be stripped of all of their jewelry, right? So they didn't just lose the land, they lost their land, they lost the products of that land, the fruits, the trees, the oil, everything, the stability, the ability to get an education, and what that means over several generations. Well, how do you compute that? How do you restore that? And that's what I would like those who are able to start thinking about, because that's critical. So our people who are starving in Gaza, a few feet away, have orange groves that some kid from Brooklyn can now go and take. The people in Yarmouk who are begging for food from the UN live a few miles away, used to live a few miles away in the north of Palestine, a seacoast, a coastal town that would beautiful on so many levels and very productive. So what does that mean for their legacy? Where does that go, right? What have they lost and how do they compute that? And so restoration and reparations and redistribution is a critical part of Palestinian return. And that would happen through tribunals and investigations and all of that. So I can't imagine it being a complete one, but it has to be something that is meaningful in some way so as to undo the privilege that has been done by the dynamics of power and supremacy. And to answer the brother's question, that's a critical question, and I love that you asked that question. Most of the camps are organized based on towns, even internally. Even the streets within the refugee camps refer to the towns and even the neighborhoods in the towns that the Palestinians live. So there's already a mapping, an organic, natural self-mapping of how to return. There are also many projects that are now starting, and they've been in the works for years. That doesn't mean that we don't have our own projects to do, and I think the more projects, the better. But there is a project that is trying to locate and register as many Palestinian refugees as possible outside of the framework that is provided by the Palestinian Authority and other quote-unquote authorities, right? Which I think that we're seeing the beginning of the end of the PA, and their desperate attempt to hold on to their legitimacy is their attempt to file at the ICC, which, by the way, they're trying to withdraw, but they can't because it's too late. Yeah. I mean, once you file, you can't withdraw. It's beyond them. It's like filing a police report. The investigation is no longer in your hands. But anyway, so there are a few projects, and if you want, we can talk about it, and I can give you some. But yes, I think that documenting our history and our connections and our relationships is important, and joining programs that do that and holding those programs accountable, because even though they're not, the PLO or the PA, I mean, they should be accountable to the people that they're speaking for. Apartheid is a failure, reparations, restoration. The 10% question. Yeah, I mean, and the 10%, Michael, is if the Palestinians chose to return to their original homes, which, considering the magnanimous nature of the Palestinian people, Allahu Alam, but so the 10% is if they return to their actual original homes, then they would be a displacement. Displacement being move a few feet over, and there's still plenty of room. And that's been the struggle of the Zionist project, is to constantly find the human bodies, the human shields, to take up the space so as to displace the Palestinians, right? And that's their ongoing struggle. Kind of like it's related to their struggle of keeping themselves as legitimate Jewish state. There isn't a popular, So, yes, right. They're happy to leave. And I'll turn it over to David to answer a really important question. I think we got all of them.
Yes,
right?
somebody asked, if I understood the question correctly, the marginalization of Jewish people in Jewish communities, was that it? And sort of how to get into, I think it was the gentleman in the back.
Mainstream synagogue.
Was that? Yeah, I mean, my feeling is that, I don't know how to get into the synagogue, if that's what you mean. But I do know that it can't involve compromise. It can't involve compromising your values. It can't involve selling out or betraying what people demand the call for justice. And if you can't get into the temple or the synagogue demanding justice, then stay outside and confront the temple and confront people there in whatever way that you can. But I don't see much value in any more than if somebody said, "Yeah, but we're anti-Zionist and we're pushed aside by Israeli society." I'd say, "Yeah, I don't want to be a part of that society, and I'll continue to advocate for justice outside that framework. And then if there's a space to be invited in, I'm perfectly happy to go into any synagogue anywhere and give this presentation." But what I'm not going to do is excise out the things on the basis that some of the people there are going to be upset, annoyed, disturbed. That's not, to me, part of the equation.
Can I
just say one other quick thing? I just wanted
yeah.
to build on what you said. It's interesting in the statement that we just came out with, that I mentioned about the Israel apartheid state not speaking for us. We discussed in the writing of it removing reference to 194 precisely for that reason. I mean, my way of thinking is, supposing tomorrow the UN got together and decided to rescind Resolution 194, it would make no difference in terms of the right. We wouldn't go, "Oh, well, I guess that's it. They decided. They rescinded." No, we only support those things to the degree that they reaffirm an underlying human right, which is what I take it you're saying. And we put it in the statement only to the degree at the bottom that it mirrors the literal call from BDS, because it is in the BDS call, and we felt a certain responsibility to do that. But I just thought it was interesting you raised that, because we had been discussing the same idea of moving away from laws and legality, because what's legal Monday can be illegal Wednesday and made legal again Friday. But underlying rights are inalienable, and that's what we should be committed to.
I think that I mentioned apartheid. I mentioned just different forms of oppression that are happening simultaneously as part of the Palestinian experience right now. And Ilyas Khoury talks about the ongoing Nakba. I mean, there's a Nakba every day, and that Nakba is the trauma and the experience that's relived materially. The thing about drawing connections with other struggles is that it becomes it's more parallel, that experience, that historical experience that we're also living right now. I mean, Native Americans live in reservations now. We live in a white supremacist society now. Speaking of it as a white supremacist society doesn't obviate our responsibility that actually we are reaping the benefits of that privilege now in a material way. It challenges us as human beings to be willing to give up, in a material sense, certain privileges to make this thing okay. It's not a reparations by a court that through a process determines who is entitled, right? That is a mechanism. But the understanding within our society is that that needs to be formulated. That's a level of consciousness that we need to reach. Direct actions, protests, things like that, they're more about raising consciousness and more about engagement. And then there's people who engage in solidarity. Then there are, Palestinians who are struggling just by existence. I'll address what the brother said over here, but I want to say there's also a class thing and a gender thing, right, and a race thing that's happening in all of these. They get covered up by the Palestine question, or they get covered up by, the United States, police question. These are issues. The dispossession of people of their property is a redistribution of wealth. I mean, it's a redistribution of wealth. It's just one group of people is dehumanized, and then people don't think anyone got wronged, right? So when we think about accumulation by dispossession, which is something that David Harvey talks about, which occurs in the context of gentrification, it's just more intensified in the context of a war. What's happening in Syria? 80% right now live below the poverty line, right? That was a redistribution of wealth. And most likely, it didn't go to other people. And in this context, it wasn't Jewish people that took it. It was probably corporations. It's probably a debt owed based on all of this involvement, huh? Gas pipelines, right? So there's something there. There's connections to be drawn. The tricky thing about drawing these type of connections is that we need to maintain the specificities of struggle, because the experiences are real for the people that are encouraging. Intellectually, we can draw these connections. It becomes important for the overall political horizon that we're trying to reach. But yet, we also need to recognize that a black person is getting killed every 28 hours. They're going to be engaging in the struggle a little bit different. Their liberation is connected to ours. If theirs isn't there, mine is non-existent. But then how do we connect these things together is our challenge, and the challenge of people who have more time. I want to say that, look, I'm very familiar with the apathy of the Palestinian people because of how much they've gone through. And it's no one to judge a fellow Palestinian about where they are in the struggle. That is absolute. I will say this, that as a Palestinian who has resisted in my lifetime, who then went on to get a corporate job, who then left it for poverty, was my and I right now I'm on welfare. I chose to engage in the struggle wholeheartedly because it's about my soul and what I can do with the kind of privilege that I have. That's my personal choice. That is not what other people will do. A person who got out of Gaza, God bless them, they did what they had to do. All of this is happening, right? But I don't go and protest because I think a protest is going to change the world. But I'm still searching for that thing, and maybe it's about changing each other, and maybe the struggle is about the practice and the training, the training and the practice of freedom. I mean, who's a guarantee that if you get a state, you feel free or you treat other people? Palestinian Authority, when they first came in, right, they took a third of my dad's business. My dad went from being a middle class. That's what happened to all Palestinians, by the way, right? They have been pushed down, their wealth taken in all sorts of ways. But the Palestinian Authority was no different. And then they came in, and then they started oppressing us, and then they started torturing us. There's no guarantee. Oppression doesn't. You just create sub-oppressors. So then there's something in us that also needs to change, and engaging in the struggle is part of it.
I think that a lot of it comes back to you, and I think that you did pose a really important question, and I understood it to mean we have not seen any progress. To the contrary, we've seen the de-evolution of the situation in Palestine, and I think that's what you're talking about, is that you haven't seen anything change there. Mazboot?
Not at all.
Yeah, and that's true.
That's true.
And the reality is, we come here, we talk about it, and we see changes in the movement happening in the U.S. and globally, in increasing. Or in moving towards helping end the impunity of the Zionist entity. We're definitely seeing that happen, and that's going to be critical to changing conditions on the ground. And that's really the key. What we've seen, I've been organizing around Palestinian issues for 15 years. When I first came to the U.S., my teacher in elementary school failed me, okay? She whited out my report card and forged it after I submitted a report saying that I was from Palestine, the land where Jesus came from, right? That's what it was like, a couple of decades ago. And my mother had to go to school and say, well, it's obvious, we're not stupid. We know what whiteout is. We might be immigrants, but we know what whiteout is, and we could see what happened here. And so, 1994, you still couldn't say Palestine, right? Michael was talking about the early 80s. You couldn't say Palestine. To the 60s, you couldn't say Palestine. So these are really incremental steps that have happened in the international solidarity movement, not just the U.S., right? In the international solidarity movement. 2000, there was more space. 2000, before 9/11, I don't know if you guys were around, but the rallies were so big that the streets, the rallies in support of the Intifada were so big that the streets of New York would shake. We had hundreds of thousands of people, and it was just a handful of us that were organizing this, okay? 9/11 happened, we took 800 steps back, right? Half of the organizers were, first line of attack was against Palestinian communities and organizers. Deportations, arrests, repression, shutting down many of the Palestinian organizations. So it's been a constant challenge. The forces, if you consider the progress that we've made, in the context of the forces that we are up against, and the fact that we are in the belly of the beast, the world's superpower fighting against, which is tied in interest to the Israeli government, this is tremendous progress. Now you have Sweden and God knows how many other countries recognizing Palestine. And this is very meaningful because that recognition, it has there are some downsides to it, but it's very meaningful when it comes to legitimizing resistance to Israeli violence. That is very critical, right? Resistance on the ground to Israeli violence. What does that mean? Well, now who can also be part of supporting that resistance? If it's not illegal to be Palestinian, then it's not illegal to defend yourself as a Palestinian. This is an important move. You have the ICC issue. This is part of ending impunity of the Israeli government, their ability to commit violence and to expand without consequence. The other part of that impunity is happening through the boycott, divest, and sanctions movement. Yes, we don't have governments and we're not buying politicians, and I don't want to be part of that. I would never want to be part of that. That is antithetical to what I believe in and what I believe our struggle is about, because we ended up here because of wastat and corruption and people buying each other. That's how we ended up with what we have now, from the PA to Oslo to all of that.
And
But so I'm sorry.
is how we ended up
Yeah.
now.
Anyway, so despite that, and despite the ability to buy these powers, the the BDS movement has made it, like this wonderful man said here, and I'm sorry for trying to cut you off before, has made it a liability to support or be involved or associated, while some people still think they can stand in the middle of this room and basically be proud of their privilege, be proud of part of oppressing or supporting the violence against Palestinians. The larger world economic companies are not so proud of being associated with that entity anymore, and that's huge. The Block the Boat campaign was a brilliant campaign. They didn't let the boat stop. So now you have Israeli companies who are, finding ways to not have even the name Israel on there. So when we couldn't say Palestine, now they're afraid to say Israel, which is this is huge. It took us a while to get there, and that's huge. I'm sorry. So as far as supporting the rallies and the protests, and Joe can attest to it, and our people can attest. Countless times, our people in Palestine or in the refugee camps have specifically asked for people to go out and rally. They wanted to see us in the street. They wanted to know that they weren't forgotten, and it was a really critical tool in getting the message out, because we can't count on mainstream media to count the number of people that are massacred. So we have to do it. So we're creating alternative media, and we're showing solidarity at the request of our people in Palestine. So I totally get what you're saying, but I think it's a far more nuanced situation than we tend to think, because you go there and it's a very depressing. I think I have to stop now. I've been talking a lot.
What Amin and Lemi said is something that is very important, which is the ongoing Nakba. It's not just 1948. It is still ongoing in the Palestinian community, where there is displacement, and there is home demolitions and ethnic cleansing. It's not just ethnic cleansing. Does not just happen through genocide. It happens through sociocide and displacement of people based on their ethno-religious identity. And in 2015, the rate of home demolitions per week is higher than the rate of 2014. And these are just quick statistics that I got from an Haaretz article this week. The numbers, there are so many numbers here to read, but the displaced people in Palestine in 2014 were 1,177 people, and that's in Area C, including 41 structures for Bedouins in Jericho and Hebron and other parts of Palestine. Now, if we're looking at 2015 alone, East Jerusalem alone had 7 buildings demolished. And we are only in the first quarter of 2015. I can go on, but these are the messages that we send in Israeli Apartheid Week, because you won't hear that in mainstream media news. And this is what we try to educate the public in, letting them know that they have to be aware of this, and they can take their part in campaigns of boycott, divestment, and sanctions if they are aware of this information, and then they can research on how they can do their part. So, with that being said, I'd love to take a couple of more questions.
Jump in with one thing
Absolutely.
that I realized what I said. I realized in my in the slides that I showed that picture of Abed, and we didn't really get a chance to read. I skipped over what he had said, and I think it's perhaps not exactly germane to this discussion, but it helps me think through at least how I connect with sometimes the sense of despair about lack of change in the world. But the question that I asked him, what do you say to people who say right of return is not realistic? He says, I don't care what other people think is realistic for me. It's my right, and I'm certainly not going to, I'm paraphrasing what he said, but I'm certainly not going to make that calculation based on what people oppressing me are telling me is realistic. Right? And the way I've sort of thought of it myself as an incredibly privileged person, as someone who hasn't lived through any of the things that you guys are talking about, that as long as there's one guy like that talking, I feel it's my responsibility to support that person. Whether other people are angry about it, whether other people don't see change happening, whether other people are cynical and depressed or resigned, or whatever state that all of us get in at points of our activism, that as long as there's a single person demanding that kind of justice, it's our responsibility to do whatever we can to support it.
It's not just the right of return, it's also the right to stay that so many Palestinians are fighting
Right,
for.
to stay. That's a very good way to put it.
In East Jerusalem alone, 208 Palestinians have become homeless in 2015 alone. That's something to say about what Palestinians are actually going through when it comes to facing this ethnic cleansing. And these people have now the right to return to their homeland or to their hometown, East Jerusalem, where they were living. So this is an ongoing fight on many fronts.
I do, because first of all, I really don't mean any disrespect for how struggles were conducted throughout the history, and I think, like Michael said, they build on each other, and not one is isolated from the other. I'm not a firm believer that the state is the vehicle of liberation and change. I think that to give the kind of primacy to the state, as we have done in the left for so many years, is to simplify or ignore the world that we live in today in ways in which capital is really primary. And through the globalization discussion, people talked about what is the role of the state, what is the function of the state. And I could say that it's largely diminished to this point, and actually people should focus on the social contract and how it's being rewritten by one party. And that's people who have wealth, who have power, who have the corporations at some level. Now, does that mean, you had MLK who kind of framed it as a civil rights movement? I think you have the conclusion of the civil rights movement with Obama, right? And you have the black radical tradition reemerging, and the questions that Du Bois posed or Fanon brought up, right? Of the petty bourgeois. All these things are coming up, but we don't speak in these class things or the patriarchy that's embedded in these systems because we reproduce them every day. And so you could look at a person like John Holloway, who looked at the Zapatistas, and say, you know what, how can we change the world without taking power? And you could point then to Egypt and say, that's how you don't do it, right? Because this period that we're facing with the so-called Arab Spring, or it's reaching us today with Occupy Wall Street, and then all these other movements that actually begin to address more systemic things, not just the wealth inequality, points to the fact that we don't have what we used to have, which is a unifying ideology or an imagination of what the future could look like. We don't have that. We don't have communism. It's not an ideology. People are talking about the commons. They're trying to find a place between private and public. This becomes deeply important for the kind of issues that you bring up. It's important to know our history. It's important to give gratitude. But it's also important to say that the black people that went in the Vietnam kind of anti-war movement, right, point out the fact that the white people were in that movement, took corporate jobs. It's important to face that. Now, if we're engaged in a struggle on a South African level today, would I be blind to those? It makes it harder for me to conceive of the struggle, but I think it's important for us to revisit that. And so the second thing, and I think this is Occupy, at least at some level, I'll share this because I was one of the organizers in that. 600 emails went back and forth with the organizers before we occupied Wall Street on whether there should be any demands or not. No one could agree because the systemic nature of what we're facing and the inability to even imagine where we need to go right now is real, right? And so I'm less interested in trying to put out one formulation about how we can all get together because I don't think that'll happen. Then to focus on resistance and spaces and places and make these connections and move together. And walking, we ask questions and trying to figure out together, because I'm certain that if we don't reproduce oppression, no state can do it. Because the state is just us.
Let me.
Did you?
No?
Yeah. I want to kind of bring it back to more tangible material terms briefly. And I definitely appreciate everything that Amin is saying. And I think that in terms of moving forward practically, I think it's been very important the role that Al-Auda, the Palestine Right to Return Coalition, has played in the Palestinian movement. It's definitely one of the oldest organizations, but I think that our more important role has been to constantly be vigilant and critical of the movement as it grows. And I think that that's the most important part to ensuring the survival of the Palestinian state, and not in the vulgarized meaning of that word. I mean, we see with the Palestinian Authority, it looks like they're wearing this ill-fitted shoe and they're, thumping around and not quite sure what to do. It's a kind of vulgar form of neoliberal capitalism. They've also become tools of the Zionist occupation. I mean, they're an element that really should be dismantled, and soon, in order for the Palestinian resistance to achieve what it really is capable of achieving at this point. And the realities on the ground is that the Zionist entity, that the Israeli government, is really in a race. There's a reason that they are building more now than they did last year and the years before. There really is a race to create facts on the ground. There is a race to physically legitimize the Zionist entity. And there's a race to basically recreate and reshape these borders, and we have to be vigilant of that, and what our role is in that, and how we can reimagine those quote-unquote realities that are being made on the ground. And I think that goes back to the question that Joe answered about, what does justice and what does one state look like. And I think it's up to us to reimagine and recreate, really the economic systems that will allow for restorative justice for the Palestinians, and not work within this box that's been a complete failure for us globally, but certainly in the Arab world. And it's the reality is, whether you're looking west or east of Palestine, is that the state systems are falling apart. And what alternatives are we creating to replace that system? My vision of Palestine, when I say Palestine, I don't mean just this map, right, that we see, no, I mean beyond that. Palestine is something beyond that, right? It's me going from Nablus to Damascus to Damascus, right? It's ending the kind of the borders that were drawn by colonizing powers, essentially. And how do we do that? And what does that look like when we say Palestinian refugees return? Well, if you look at it in that context, then it's a different formulation than just doing the math of reparations, right? It's a completely different calculation, I think. And so bringing it back to Al-Awda and centralizing the right to return, I think it's great that movements are growing and that they have their own trajectory and they have their own power. But I think it's also important that we constantly challenge and check these movements. There was a time where our biggest struggle was really with liberal Zionists who said, well, we support you, but this is the ceiling of our support for you. And it was people like Michael and organizations like Al-Awda and Jews for Palestinian Right of Return that really challenged that and normalized the language of full return, full liberation, the right to resist, which then echoes throughout and then becomes, language, we can't take language lightly. Language shapes our approach to things, it shapes our ideas, it shapes our realities. We need to move away from the framework of Israeli power, which is real, right? But understand that we also have power and that we're capable of working towards recreating it. Now we got to get creative with that. We're facing massive military power. How do we do that? And really outlining it. What I would love to see is really a session of where we sit down and identify and analyze what is our capacity individually and organizationally to be part of, number one, curbing that power, number two, curbing that violence, and number three, being part of really checking and making sure that constantly the movement is acting on full principles of liberation, right? Reimagining what our society looks like, not within the Oslo framework or the Palestinian Authority framework or the Israeli framework. And I'd like just to end on that and to please, for whoever is organizing, from DAF, to us, to SJP, really centralize, even if it's a footnote, but really always keep the Palestinian right to return central to all of our work, consciously, and more actively so than we have been doing. I think that would be a great achievement and maybe a goal that we can have for 2015. So thank you, Hani and SJP and Jews for Palestine.
And now please join me in thanking Students for Justice in Palestine for hosting this event, and Student Senate, and Student Senate for co-sponsoring this event and in welcoming our speakers.